Hello and welcome back to The Editorial, the podcast where we discuss why everyone hates TLDR news. I'm joined as always by Editor-in-Chief Zach Michaelis.
Yeah, hello.
And I'm Jack. Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
The key thing we want to talk about in this episode is the NATO summit, which we have literally just come back from. We conducted a bunch of interviews there, all of which are linked in a playlist, which should be in the description of this video. And we want to discuss how that happened, some of the behind the scenes, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Before we get to that though, let's do some normal editorializing. What videos have we released lately that have been contentious or are worth discussing?
So the last editorial we did was 2 weeks ago, which is good of us because we're actually keeping to schedule at the moment. Yeah, well done us. There have been a couple of contentious ones, like the people who watch this regularly. I don't know if any of you exist, but we do normally just look at the like-dislike ratio, and basically if it's below sort of like 96 and 97, and we sort of normally there's some sort of controversy that's causing that slightly lower than average like-dislike ratio. So on the 3 channels, there's nothing controversial on UK, I don't think.
Okay.
There was a little bit controversial on EU, but I don't think there's actually much we need to apologise for. So there are basically sort of 2 videos that are worth mentioning. And the first one is one that we did basically 2 weeks ago, which is about Turkey. Will Turkey ever let Sweden into NATO?
Yeah.
And this was done basically off the back of that story that Sweden greenlit a Quran burning protest, and obviously Turkey didn't really like that, and they sort of added it to their list of demands for letting Sweden into NATO. And I mean, obviously this now looks this is a slightly outdated take, but at the time it looked like Sweden wasn't getting into NATO. It looked like this sort of escalating list of demands it was constantly escalating, and Erdogan was going a lot further than what was agreed in the trilateral memorandum, which happened sort of in July last year, which was supposed to set out sort of 3 conditions for Sweden's accession to NATO. Yeah. And every time the Swedes were like, well, no, but this is all we can do. We're constitutionally prohibited from going any further. Yeah. Erdogan would just be like, nah. And you could tell this was because Erdogan wanted other things. Yeah. He was sort of coming with new demands so that he could maintain his leverage and put more pressure on, like, the Americans, for example, to get F-16s and F-35s, which are those jets that they basically spent a whole load of money on a while ago. And the Americans said, no, you can't have them because the Turks bought a Russian S-400 air defense system. Yeah, and obviously that does look outdated now that Sweden has joined NATO. Yeah, whatever. But I think it's a lower than average like-dislike ratio, and I just think that that's because there was some controversy in the comments. I don't think we really did anything here about, like, people thought we should have gone harder on the Quran burning stuff. And there was a lot of people basically suggesting that we didn't really articulate quite how, and this is their opinion, not mine, quite how ridiculous it is that Erdogan wants to ban Quran burning. And basically saying that we weren't taking a strong enough stance against Erdogan. I think that's a fair take. You're obviously entitled to that opinion. I don't think it's unreasonable at all. I just don't think it's really it's not pertinent to the content of the video. Yeah. We're just trying to describe the situation here. I'm not taking a side by articulating Erdogan's position here. And all we were trying to say was that we were really talking about the fact that it was difficult or unlikely at the time that Sweden was going to join NATO. The fact this was another obstacle to Sweden's NATO accession. And so, the sort of moral issue of Quran burning and how that interacts with, like, freedom of speech is just sort of by the by. It's not really something that the video is going to focus on. So I see where people are going from, and it's definitely something that's sort of like intellectually interesting. It just wasn't really pertinent to the video, so we didn't really go into it in much depth.
And isn't really our tone, as you say. That feels more like taking a stance on it rather than just describing the facts. Yeah. And sure, sometimes we maybe lean into that a tiny bit, but broadly we try not to.
I think it was a whole video on that one thing. Like, we did, like, the Quran burning protest explained. Then maybe we could go into more detail on that, but it wasn't. It was secondary to the.
It was an element of his demands.
Yeah, exactly. There was one other one which was on Finland's political crisis. That still has like a 96.4% like-dislike ratio. Again, I think it's just because it's a controversial topic. A lot of it is about the Finns party, and whether or not you can label them as far right is obviously debated.
Yeah, always contentious.
Always contentious, and nonetheless, like, even just sort of talking about these sort of parties evokes some pretty passionate debate in the comments. And some people didn't like our characterization of them. They thought we were too soft, and that we should describe them, as sort of with harsher, stronger language. You know, we didn't use the term far right. This one, we just said right wing. People were saying you should have said far right. You should have said nativist. You've got to call a spade and all that sort of thing. And on the other side of things, people thought we were cherry picking comments
that made them look bad.
That made them look bad. But again, I don't really think we have anything to apologise here. I'm obviously sympathetic to this, and like the semantics do matter. But this was a story about the political crisis, and the cause of the political crisis were the bad comments. You know, if this was, again, I think this is the whole thing about like how much time and detail we're going to spend on something that is fundamentally secondary to the main thrust of the video. And in this case, like if we were doing a video explaining the ideology of the Finns party, yeah, of course, like you want to do a whole balance thing, but actually we just talk about the government crisis, and the government crisis was caused by the controversial comments made by the various Finns party MPs, essentially.
Sure.
So I don't think we would have anything to apologise on those two. I just think they are inherently controversial topics, and that slightly explains. I mean, blowback is too strong, but that slightly explains like some of the controversy and the slightly lower than average dislike ratio. So that's that on EU. The one global, we have again, I think probably 2 videos on this.
Okay.
And the first one is the Israel-Palestine conflict. Again, I think I don't want to talk about this for too long for obvious reasons.
Sure.
Definitely going to make a slip somewhere. But again, we got pushback from both sides there. So it has like a 95% like dislike ratio, which, by the way, for Israel-Palestine content generally,
not terrible.
Pretty brilliant.
Yeah.
And we got pushback from both sides. I mean, you got pushback from sort of pro-Israel people, accounts, who were basically suggesting that we didn't sufficiently articulate either like what they saw as Palestinian aggression provoking an Israeli retaliation, or the sort of central role of that refugee camp as a sort of base for Palestinian militants. And then conversely, we got pushback from sort of pro-Palestinian users who were suggesting that we didn't properly articulate, you know, the sort of moral repulsiveness of the Israeli occupation. Again, I'm not endorsing that side, I'm just articulating it. The moral repulsiveness of what they see as the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. So yeah, I think that's just a controversial topic. I don't think we necessarily got anything wrong there. I think that the outlines of that video are pretty good, and I think that actually, again, like the other ones, we didn't want to spend too long on like the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict and sort of like articulating both sides. What we really want to talk about is the more recent deterioration in relations. So I want to talk essentially about how, I'd say, the past 6 months or so, ever since the new, probably longer than that, but ever since the new Netanyahu-led government came into power, there has been a real uptick in violence and a really sharp deterioration in Israel-Palestine relationships. And we wanted to sort of describe this escalatory spiral that the two sides are stuck in at the moment. And that's, I think, like, at least from like the geopolitical perspective, that is the important thing. That's the scary thing, because obviously if that sort of feedback loop isn't stopped at some point, you do run the risk of like serious destabilization in the region and possibly a third intifada. Then the other video that we want to talk about is why China is pretty bad at soft power. Yeah. We've talked about our China content before, and there's this tension because you sort of have to hook China videos with a slightly negative spin. Because that does seem to be what like the YouTube audience and algorithm is favorable towards. You know, those videos just do better. Yeah, definitely. But it is a legitimate topic, definitely, and it is just true. And China is what it has been. I think it's actually making progress in this respect, but China is pretty bad at soft power. And a lot of people are pointing out that like there's sort of unfair there's a selective bias here going on, because we're not talking about, like, for example, how bad the US is at soft power. I would say at least 2 things here. And I think the 2 things here, the first is that this comes back again to the fact that we just don't really do US content. The other thing is that there's no exclusivity implied here. And that, you know, China is pretty unpopular, especially in the developed world. And it's more popular in parts of Africa and the Middle East, but even then I think that polling should be taken with a pinch of salt. And of course, like, America is deeply unpopular in much of the world. I mean, especially under Trump, America had very, very negative approval ratings, not just in like the Middle East, obviously, but also in Europe. And that might change again. So there's no exclusivity implied there when we're talking about like China being unpopular. I'm not suggesting that by sort of implication, the Americans are very popular. And those are basically the 2 things I would say. Is that I think it is a legitimate topic of conversation. It's a legitimate topic because the CCP recognise it. I mean, that's why they've pulled back on the wolf warrior diplomacy stuff.
Yeah.
And also that there is no exclusivity implied there, and that we're not suggesting that the Americans are popular. Anyway, yeah. So I think those are sort of the videos that we should have addressed.
There was also the China video which went up, had a technical issue, and then came back down.
Yeah. Okay. Sure.
Nothing necessarily wrong, but like worth highlighting. This happened and why it happened.
Yeah, of course. So we did a video basically on China's foreign exchange reserves, most of which are dollar denominated, and the fact that there's this paper out by a guy called Brad Setzer, who's just a super smart dude. Go read the paper. It's in the video. About how China has started essentially hiding some of its dollar reserves, and why this sort of opacity poses a systemic risk to global finance. And when we did the original video, I was just a pillock, and I said that China is running a trade deficit, when obviously I meant trade surplus.
Yeah.
And obviously because that's sort of central to the video, that's like the whole point. That's how China accumulates dollars, and that's why it has such massive dollar reserves. I said like 4 times that it's running a trade deficit, and it's just confusing to the audience. And like most of the audience clearly realizes it's wrong. There's a whole lot of comments being like, I think you got that wrong. Yeah. But given that it's so important to like just the structure of the video, we thought that we should take it down, redo it, and then re-upload it. And so that's what we did. We took it down on the July 5th, and we re-uploaded on the July 7th. Seems to have gone down very well in its new form. This is 98.3 like-dislike ratio.
Nice.
I'm really glad we did it. I think sometimes when we make slightly smaller mistakes, we normally keep the video up and just maybe pin a comment or something like that, just because it's the video is bound to do a lot worse if you re-upload it. But yeah, I'm glad that we did it with that one, and I think the video in itself was actually really quite good.
So, you should go and watch it then.
You should go.
Everyone should go and watch
it.
So that's the last 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Also in the last 2 weeks, as I said a moment ago, we've been to NATO.
We have been to NATO.
I think there's some interesting questions here. I think it's also just a fun thing that happened. I think people might be interested in hearing about it.
Yeah, maybe.
So I think the first thing to say is like how we ended up going, because it's the kind of event, it's not like if you pay enough, they'll sell you a ticket, obviously. So we were invited by Google and YouTube to host a series of interviews at the NATO Public Forum YouTube studio. The order of those words is apparently very important, it turns out. Someone has negotiated which order those words go, and there's been some contract signed. But essentially they had a studio right behind the main public forum stage where a bunch of people spoke. And the studio was hosted by YouTube, and they got ourselves and a couple of other YouTubers on to ask a bunch of questions. And I guess the idea is that it opens up these politicians to a more YouTube audience, a younger audience. It's a good way for YouTube and Google to present themselves, and they wanted YouTubers to be hosting these interviews rather than regular journalists, just because it wouldn't make much sense having a YouTube studio that was hosted by someone from the BBC or whatever. Yeah. So a bit like when we hosted a bunch of interviews at MSC, we were invited down, we were told in advance a vague list of people we might be able to speak to. And then as time went on, we were offered additional people. They tried to grab people, add people on the list, etc. So we had a vague idea going in who we were speaking to. We prepared some questions, etc. And that's kind of what we were going into. And that's kind of why they wanted to work with us, because we were a prominent news channel that's broadly neutral, and they think was brand safe to work with NATO and with politicians, I suppose. We arrived. It's a weird environment. I think it's hard to articulate quite how odd it is going into a space like that in our position. Yeah. I think just the rooms themselves, the level of security is obviously ridiculous. The number of like snipers on roofs and stuff you see becomes quickly normalized, but it's still very odd. Yeah. And even just us having like lanyards that allow us through special doors and stuff is weird. Yeah. But yeah, we arrived, we did a bunch of interviews and stuff. Do you want to talk about the process? So obviously I've said we knew some of the people in advance and we prepared questions for, but do you want to run through the process of when we're offered an interview, how we decide whether we think it's worth doing or not, and also what we're going to ask in those interviews?
Okay. Yeah, so I think on the Yeah. Okay. So I think the when it comes to like how we decide whether or not an interview is going to be worth doing, it normally depends on sort of what questions we think we can ask the person and how we think we can include those in future videos, or how we think we can sort of like use those as a base for a future video. So I'll give you a good example. For a while, we've wanted to do a video on Russia's expanding military presence in the Arctic, and we got the chance to interview a guy called Angus Lapsley, who, amongst other things, is a sort of a bit of an expert in like NATO and the Arctic, and he's giving some oral evidence, to a House of Commons Select Committee later this month on specifically that topic. So you get to ask him that question, and not only is it like helpful just for me because it's sort of new content, it's proper expertise on a topic. Yeah. It also means we can include that sort of clip in the video, and I think some of the audience don't really like this. I completely understand that. So some people sometimes, I think essentially the issue here is that sometimes they're a bit information light. Our videos are supposed to be really information dense. We're trying to cram as much in to sort of 8-minute video, trying to explain like quite a big geopolitical topic in just 8 minutes. And sometimes politicians and sort of like policymakers, just because that's just how normal speech works, it's not that information dense. And
it's not pre-scripted and read off a teleprompter.
It's not pre-scripted, no. And so sometimes that people don't like sort of how it interrupts the pacing of a video almost. And I'm very sympathetic to that. I still think it's quite. I still think that it can be done well. Essentially here, like I think one of the things we try and make sure to do is to never include too big a chunk of an interview, and also try and make sure that it's directly related to that bit of the script. So to make sure that we're not trying to sort of rejig the script to include bits from interviews and stuff like that. And that is basically the main thing we're thinking about when we're asking questions. With all these things, there is this sort of there is a trade-off though, and I think you should be explicit about this trade-off, which is that when you're interviewing anyone from any sort of from the political class, let's just say, let's just use that as a term to cover off politicians, policymakers, NATO people, like those are. You're trying to strike this balance. You are trying to, in some sense, invest in that relationship.
Sure.
And there are also just sort of expectations about what you're supposed to ask. So when you come to investing in a relationship, that does mean implicitly that if you're asking questions, we're still trying to squeeze the same content out of them, but they do have to be framed in like a relatively delicate way. Like a good example is like we've also been wanting to do a video, and we actually have done a video on Global about NATO's interest in the Indo-Pacific. And if you're going to ask a politician, a NATO guy about this, there's a nice way to ask it, which is sort of like, how much interest do you think NATO should be paying to the Indo-Pacific? And then there's a slightly sort of harder hitting way to answer it, which is like, there's this disagreement over the Tokyo liaison office. Macron says no, everyone else says yes. Does everyone hate Macron? What do you think they should do about the Indo-Pacific? And I think what's sort of fortunate from an editorial perspective is that normally the incentives actually align here, because you're more likely to get an informative answer out of asking like the slightly, I mean, soft is too strong. It's not soft, but the slightly like more convivial question than you are from asking like the more aggressive question. And we're still conscious of the trade-off there. And then when it comes to, so the first one was investing in the relationship, and when it comes to, the expectations, you are at a NATO summit, and we can't just ask, let's say we wanted to do a video on like the France riots. You can't just get Macron there at the NATO summit and be like, so the riots, what are you going to do about them? There's a context. You have to sort of ask something that is at least sort of NATO adjacent, foreign policy or something like that. And that obviously limits the questions we can ask as well. So that's how we decide on interviews, and that's how we decide on the questions. In practice, we should say that we don't really say no to interviews there, because NATO content is interesting generally. And there's normally a question you can ask. Basically anyone who's sort of involved in NATO, or like a head of state or a foreign minister or whatever. There's always a cool question to ask there. Even if it has to be preceded by a couple of more generic questions about NATO. So I think we should just at least be conscious of that trade-off.
I think it's also worth saying that we do still maintain complete freedom within this relationship. We could say no. We basically don't, because these are interesting people, we want to talk to them. That's why they're being offered to us.
Yeah.
And equally, we can choose the framing of the questions.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. There's an incentive there that we want to ask questions in a way where they're going to get a actually useful response, because we're trying to use it in an explainer video. We're not trying to get a clip that goes viral because we slammed some NATO official. We're trying to get a clip that someone is explaining something and it fits in the video.
Yeah, you've articulated that perfectly. Yeah, the incentives are different, I think, to normal news channels.
Completely.
You're right, that they want to get a sort of like gotcha question a little bit more than we do. And so that they have this more direct trade-off, because they also want to invest in the relationship. So they're like, oh, do I be nice and hope to get a better interview next time?
Yeah.
Or do I go for my gotcha and hope to get views in this time? Whereas luckily, because we're not going for gotchas, we don't have such a stark contradiction of incentives.
That being said, though, we have complete control over the questions we're asking. I think some of the questions were run by NATO ahead of time, but they never had the ability to totally veto questions. We still wrote the question. The final version of the questions are written in the format we wanted. And to be honest, I mean, most of the time I kind of paraphrased the questions regardless.
It was interesting. I think so. This was all unclassified. I hope.
Sure.
Yeah. Hopefully I don't get taken out by NATO. But the
the snipers are still on the roofs.
Ahead of time, they asked us to like give us a list of questions, and then there was a bit of back and forth between us on the questions. We only really had one point of disagreement, and that is when I insisted on asking a question to Shashank Joshi, who's a defense editor of The Economist, about the Bucharest Declaration in 2008. Which is the declaration. It was when 2008, when basically Ukraine and Georgia were sort of applying to be NATO members. They want to be part of NATO. And there's disagreement within NATO about whether or not that should happen. So France and Germany were a bit wary of upsetting Russia, and the Americans under George Bush at the time were super keen on just getting them in.
Yeah.
And in the end, they decided on, instead of giving Ukraine a membership action plan, which the French and the Germans thought was too much, they decided on this middle ground where they just said Ukraine will join NATO. And it was a rubbish fudge. I think we can say that fairly in retrospect, because it was enough to annoy Putin, who's been railing about NATO expansion ever since, but it wasn't enough to deter him, hence the invasion in 2014 and last year. And we wanted to ask the question, Shashank Joshi about that. And the NATO official was understandably like a little bit wary of that, because you're sort of slamming NATO in a question.
Yeah.
But and I understand that wariness, but actually in the end they just said fine.
Yeah.
And they were, I think what basically happened is at the very, very beginning, there was probably some people within NATO who were just a little bit wary. They're just fundamentally unfamiliar with like a YouTube channel. They didn't necessarily trust us, which is entirely fair enough.
Yeah.
But literally the second we got in there, I think they realized that we weren't going to be there to ask sort of either gotcha questions or sort of like weird pop culture questions. I don't know if that's what they assumed the YouTube channel would be doing. I'm not going to ask Macron to do a Fortnite dance or something stupid like that. But I think once they realized, and then once we had that trust established, we had complete editorial control.
Yeah.
And you're right. I mean, even the questions that we originally had, they didn't even go on the tablet you were asking off. We were just given an entirely new Google doc.
We could just submit whatever we wanted.
Just put
it straight on. I could start ask it.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately most of their feedback on questions was generally around, this won't get the answer you're looking for, or they won't be able to answer this.
Yeah.
And that actually is useful. That's not them censoring or controlling what we're saying. That's actually useful feedback, because a lot of the time we have a few minutes, and if they know for sure that we won't get the answer we want, then what's the point in getting a kind of a PRE 90-second answer on something we don't actually use?
Exactly.
And in that instance, we could still decide, I think we might get an answer, or it's worth the risk. But that's generally it was more about tone and about what would and wouldn't likely work, rather than them trying to dictate what was asked.
Yeah, I think, exactly. And that's what they were saying. Like, so one of the other points of disagreement originally was about the liaison office and whether or not we could ask questions about the liaison office.
Sure.
And it wasn't, though, because they were like, oh, it's super sensitive, don't talk about it. I mean, everyone's talking about it.
Everyone on the main stage is talking about it.
I mean, it's not going to be a thing. It's just because the second you ask about the liaison office, they just all clam up and they go like, there is actually great cohesion within NATO. You don't have to worry about it. You're like, okay, fine, I've wasted a minute of my 5-minute interview. But I think that the headline here is that NATO were great about it. I mean, now I sound like a shill, but I'm not even being. NATO were genuinely great about it, and we had complete editorial control. I mean, like 100 1,000,000%. We couldn't have
Whoa.
asked for more. Is that even possible?
No.
We had 100% editorial control, especially when then there was a bit of back and forth to begin with, but once we got in there, it was entirely up to us.
Yeah.
And that was pretty cool. And hopefully we did okay, and hopefully we'll be there next year.
We'll see.
No pressure.
No
YouTube,
pressure, but
NATO,
NATO.
Google, everyone
Everyone is definitely watching.
all the fans. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good summary of how it worked. I think journalistically, I think it was useful. I think we got a bunch of interesting stuff that will be coming out in the days ahead, will be fit into videos. It's currently be uploading to NATO's channel.
Yeah.
I think some of it might also end up being uploaded to our channel as well. I don't know if they're going to post all of the interviews, so if they don't post any, we'll post the rest here. But yeah, it's a stressful experience. It's a lot of...
Should we just indulge in some sort of therapy here?
Sure,
Okay,
I think, I don't know, going to the NATO summit seems fun. It seems like a fun little work trip. I feel like I'm defending myself against our own office here. But it feels like a fun little work trip where we go and do a thing and we wear some lanyards and we look fancy. But in reality, it's kind of not very long days. We're not like tortured, but like, we didn't sleep much the day we arrived. We had like 5 hours sleep. Then we were up at like 6 a.m. And then we were at NATO.
UK time.
4 a.m. UK time, yeah. And then we were at NATO until about 8 p.m. for various bus-related issues. So we were there for a really long time. And in that time, sure, you're only probably doing a couple of hours worth of interviewing, but you're constantly, when you're not there, you're in a weird environment. You're engaging with people that, as lovely as they are, is a really unfamiliar engagement, and different people, and you've got to work out vibes and who you're talking to and who people are. And then there's a constant like, do you want to talk to this person about stuff? And it's like, well, yeah, we'd love to. And then we start preparing questions and it's like, oh no, they're busy, unfortunately. And it's like, as much as they're managing it as well as they can, there's a constant kind of pressure there. And also just alternating states. You go very quickly from just like
Chit-chat.
Sat with very little to do talking to people to, oh, the Italian Deputy Prime Minister is already getting his mic put on. This was the most... The Italian Deputy Prime Minister, or President?
No, Deputy
Prime Minister. Was putting his... I don't think we even knew he was an option yet. And he was in the studio being mic'd up, and they said, do you want to talk to him? And I went in, got mic'd up too, sat down, and at the time I sat down and started introducing him, I don't think there were any full questions on my tablet yet. I think you were still typing them
away?
as I was introducing him. So it's kind of the ups and downs there are quite stressful, and just the foreignness of the whole thing, just it's a really weird environment, and that adds to it as well, I think.
No, yeah, I obviously agree. I think it is quite stressful. I think it's just the novelty, and then you're right, the foreignness of it all. I also just think it's something we're just not familiar with. Like, we just don't do interviews for really obvious reasons, for reasons we've actually talked about in a previous editorial. And so it's not our bread and butter at all. Yeah, the only other thing is I'm constantly, whenever we go to these sort of things, like I'm always hyper wary of not like falling for the shine of it all. You just sort of know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like we have to sort of stay conscious of the fact that like this is not what we do. Like we do explain a content and we try and explain things, and interviews are like they're secondary to that in lots of ways. But it can be quite sort of tempting in a way when like it's I don't want to flatter any politician there, being like it's this guy. But if Macron or someone, you do get a little bit starstruck, and you just want to be. There's a fun, like you sort of forget that this is all secondary to the primary project, which is doing explainer content.
Well, like when we stood outside trying to see Biden for like 15 minutes on like Tuesday afternoon, we heard Biden was coming by, and like everyone was stood outside at the back of the media center, and we were just there. And eventually, we just thought we're just looking at some cars that he's probably not going to get into at this stage, and we just left. But yeah.
So I think that's everything basically. No.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, nice.
Thanks for inviting us. Again, not being a show again.
Yeah.
But we appreciate being invited. It's cool that they take YouTube and kind of new media seriously more generally, even besides us. So that's cool to see. And I mean, I'd like it to be us again. So thank you.
You're lobbying for
I'm lobbying through about, how deep are we in this episode, Jan? 33 minutes deep in a podcast that no one from YouTube or NATO even began watching is maybe not the place. Maybe I should just drop them an email. But either way, I hope everyone enjoys the content and the interviews and stuff.
Yeah.
I think we did a fairly good job. Very good job. Superb job.
Well,
The best job.
Let the audience judge for themselves.
And yeah, hopefully we're able to do more of it in the future, because it is always interesting and a weird experience and a cool experience.
Yeah. Nice.
That's what happened at NATO.